Chapter 7: Liberty, Equality, and Wokery. The United States of America is Britain's proudest creation, albeit an unintentional one. Although we have long since ceased to smart over the rejection of the British rule in 1776, in the US we see the continuation and perfection of ideas formed in the British Isles. The philosophy that shaped the Constitution of the US was drawn explicitly from hard-won British constitutional freedoms and the belief that they needed to be advanced. In the middle of Thetford, in my Norfolk constituency, there is a golden statue of Thomas Paine, one of the town's most famous sons. Born there in 1737, he emigrated to Philadelphia in 1774, under the sponsorship of Benjamin Franklin. His writings provided a rallying cry for the American Revolution and were influential in the founding of the new republic. The UK and the US share a unique heritage of freedom. We are exceptional. From the Magna Carta to the US Bill of Rights, there is a clear intellectual and philosophical lineage that binds us together through the spirit of our fundanational documents. They embody a fundamental belief in the freedom of our peoples to live in peace, protected by the rule of law and strict limitations on the powers of government. For centuries, our countries have become beacons of hope for oppressed people across the world. At the same time, our culture of freedom has allowed businesses to flourish and our economies to grow, massively improving living standards for all our people. Free markets have been at the heart of our success and strength. Our countries have also known the heavy responsibility of global leadership. In the 19th century, Britain was the world's richest economy and, thanks to the Royal Navy, had its most powerful military. In the 20th century, that economic and military preeminence passed to the US. It should be a matter of pride that both countries combine that raw strength with a persistent belief in democracy and free trade, seeking to advance political and economic freedoms throughout the world. Of course, neither country has had a perfect history. Aspirations of freedom among many of our people were not fulfilled for far too long. But even as campaigners fought for equal rights, they did so on the basis that we were not living up to our stated values. The moral standard has always been set high for us, even when we have fallen short. That is the fundamental and enduring difference between us and the repressive regimes that oppose such aspirations in principle. It is these ideas that have provided a powerful lodestar for the free world. Yet these ideas are being increasingly questioned, not just by totalitarian regimes that have never believed in freedom, but within our own societies. People benefiting from free speech and a free media have used these advantages to try and challenge our underlying values. They reject British and American exceptionalism. In fact, they often claim that the UK and the US are uniquely bad and that our countries have had a negative influence on the world. From extremist environmentalists to degrowthers to decolonizers, they question the very ideas that have underpinned progress. Even scientific facts discovered during the Enlightenment are now debated as if they are matters of opinion and politics. Even the basic tenets of biology. When I entered politics in 2010, I had absolutely no idea that less than a decade later, I would become embroiled in a debate about whether a woman could have a penis. It started with a tweet. Back in April 2018, I tweeted in support of Mumsnet, the online forum for mothers, over their insistence on having a free discussion on transgender policy. I believe in free speech and not shouting down those with opposing opinions. My fundamental view was that adults should be free to live their lives as they want. I was also clear that women were defined as biologically female. I thought nothing of this common sense position and got back to my day job at the Treasury. It was just under 18 months later that I got a call from an aide to the Prime Minister asking me if I still agreed with my tweet. I knew where this was leading. Amber Rudd had just resigned from the Cabinet as Work and Pensions Secretary, having held the additional role of Minister for Women and Equalities. Sure enough, I was called by the Prime Minister himself asking me to be Equality Minister. In typical Boris fashion, he told me, "Liz, I want you to be a Geoffrey Boycott in this role," a reference to the famously cautious England cricketer of the 1970s, presumably suggesting he wanted me to play defence on the issue, hose things down, and not create any trouble. That might have suited him, but I don't really see myself as a Geoffrey Boycott figure. I told Boris I preferred Ian Botham, the charismatic attacking cricketer who once grew so frustrated with Boycott's negativity that he conspired with the opposition to dismiss him from the match. Boris countered by suggesting that he saw me as a more of a Ben Stokes, the modern-day England star, and so it went on. It was somewhat surreal to be conducting a ministerial appointment through the medium of an extended critic metaphor. But we eventually agreed and I would step up to the crease. Coincidentally, in my trade role, I later persuaded Boris to appoint Ian, now Lord Botham, to be his trade envoy to Australia, a country that has generally had the better of its cricket battles with England, but against whom Botham achieved some of his greatest triumphs. On taking up this additional portfolio, I became responsible for the Government Equalities Office, a rather strange beast in the Whitehall jungle, which sat within the Cabinet Office. I also inherited an LGBTQ action plan that had been drafted by my predecessor, but one Penny Mordaunt, and which included a whole pan of hot potatoes, including baking for self-identification for transgender people and a ban on conversion therapy, which had the potential to become very contentious. While I supported the right of adults to live freely, wearing the clothes they wanted, and making the changes to their bodies they wanted, there were three major problems with their proposals. Firstly, I was concerned about under-18s who had not yet developed adult decision-making capabilities. I was clear that it was wrong for them to be allowed, let alone encouraged, to make irreversible decisions about their bodies by taking puberty blockers or undergoing some kind of surgery. Secondly, it was important that women's sex-based rights were protected. For generations, we had fought for these rights and safety and fair treatment. It was important that single-sex facilities, such as changing rooms and refugees and women's supports competitions, were protected and maintained. Finally, there was the issue of free speech. I was not prepared to allow Orwellian newspeak to push out normal language about women. For example, the mantra that trans women are women, or the notion being promulgated by the NHS that people have periods or give birth. Anyone should be able to express themselves freely and honestly about the world around them and not be pilloried. Instead, livelihoods have been destroyed over the expression of simple facts. The first noteworthy case in the UK was that of researcher Maya Forrester, who didn't have her contract renewed at the Centre for Global Development in 2019, after she described transgender women as men. She took a case to an employment tribunal, which concluded that she had been a victim of discrimination on the grounds of her beliefs, and she won compensation of nearly £100,000 for loss of earnings, injury to her feelings, and aggravated damages. But that came after 3.5 years of legal wrangling. Her views, shared by me and backed by the vast majority of the British public, put me into direct conflict with the trans rights lobby. I was labelled evil, vile, a bigot, a homophobe, a disgusting transphobe, and much else besides. Stonewall, a UK charity that had previously campaigned for the fair treatment of gay people, a cause I supported, had now become obsessed with the trans debate. They had their proposition to put pressure on government departments and public bodies, which, along with large corporations, have been paying Stonewall for their console on the LGBTQ issues, so their influence was considerable. Anyone who didn't agree with them was regarded as a bigot. I discovered that companies had been encouraged to adopt policies around pronouns and gender-neutral facilities, under threat of having their Stonewall approval removed. It was akin to a woke protection racket. I was more than used to making arguments against the intolerant left. I was a veteran of these battles, having had fights as a student at Oxford University in the 90s. I had abhorred the bullying of gay students at my school and opposed Section 28, a ludicrous piece of legislation that effectively stopped teachers from talking to pupils about homosexuality. I also virtually objected whenever I felt that my being a girl meant I was treated differently to my brothers. What I discovered after being elected to the Oxford University Student Union as their executive officer was that this was not everyone's idea of equality. What the left wanted was to acknowledge the oppression of particular groups and afford them privileges accordingly. Few people, however, seemed willing to take on the left. So I did. I argued publicly that the position of women's officer was patronizing and sexist and should be abolished. But the left didn't want to have a debate about the principle. Instead, I was censored by the OUSU executive for being sexist. It was an early taste of the sheer intolerance of the left and their bullying tactics in the face of anyone who didn't agree with them. On another occasion, I refused to apologize when someone complained after I shouted across the OUSU office for one of the LGB team, no T in those days, to deal with a query from someone who called the student helpline. That in turn got me censored for being homophobic. I thought it was bizarre that some of the most privileged educated people in Britain were determined to cast themselves as victims. I discovered while taking a course on political sociology that much of the intellectual backing for identity politics came from postmodernist movement, in particular French philosopher Michel Foucault. His ideas rejected objective truth in favor of societal power structures. This postmodernist philosophy, together with later developments like critical race theory, given rise to the idea that oppressed groups had to be helped collectively. Little did I know that these ideas, which struck me as niche at the time, would become so embedded in our politics and societies. I was also surprised to see the same intolerance and victimhood that I had seen at Oxford entering the workplace. I had assumed that as these people grew up, they would become more tolerant and open-minded. Sadly, they did not. Identity politics and the modern equivalent wokeism have become endemic to our society, and businesses and the public sector. And incredibly, much of it began in the beacon of the constitutionally protected liberty, the United States of America, the home of Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1963 spoke of his dream that his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now appears to subscribe to the view that the color of your skin is more important than the content of your character. If this looking-glass world activists advocate that people of different races or sexes should be treated differently and that they are inherently different, we have heard feminists argue that the reason we had the financial crash was because women weren't running the banks and that the nuclear bomb would not have been invented if women had been running the world. This cult of female exceptionalism is equally as prejudiced as the male exceptionalism that leads to sexism against women. I found it all utterly tiresome and aggravating. Women are just as capable of making poor decisions as men, just as they are as capable of making good ones. They have just had less opportunity to do either. Instead of setting one group against another, we should judge people on their individual character and abilities. Dividing people into identity groups and arguing that we need to give them special treatment only embeds inequality. So I took on the equality brief with a very clear view of what needed to change. I knew that just as with my skirmishes at the OUSU, this would not endear me to those who had drunk the Kool-Aid of the left's identity politics. It would also be a challenge to many of the civil servants working in the Government Equalities Office, who were very much signed up to the prevailing agenda. This is a symptom of something we have seen happening more and more in government in recent years. If you're an environmentalist, you go and work at the Environment Department, and if you're an equality campaigner, you go and work at the Government Equalities Office. Thus we end up with activists as civil servants, which I don't think happened in the past and which can present real problems. Some of my conservative predecessors were content to simply go along with this direction of travel. They seemed to think that social changes were inevitable and that the Conservative Party could not afford to be left behind. This was certainly what I found on the trans and gender self-identification issues. It had become the prevailing view that this was another Section 28, and that we risked making those mistakes again and suffering the consequences of being on the wrong side of history. Many transgender people who spoke to me told me that they were horrified by the way their lives were being weaponized as part of others' agendas. They just wanted the freedom to live their lives. As well as the trans extremism, the Black Lives Matter movement was also imported from the US after the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. Even though the situation in the UK was completely different, the Labour Party leadership got in on the act by ostensibly taking the knee, while the FA directed the England football team to do likewise. I found this gesture unedifying, not to mention that it created a worrying precedent. It set off a wave of demands for historic statues to be pulled down and for people to apologise for their family's role in slavery. I think this is completely the wrong path to go down and leads to unravelling rather than progress. We all understand that accepted values have been different at different times in our history, but endless relitigation of the past both omits the strides that have been made and takes our gaze away from the present. What we should be focused on is fair treatment now. I found it incredible that people were highlighting acts of slavery that took place hundreds of years ago, but were apparently unbothered about the real slavery taking place in Zhejiang region of China. What was worrying about the woke movement was how it had a momentum of its own. Despite the views of the vast majority of the public and their elected politicians, programs and discussions on these subjects became increasingly prevalent in schools, on university campuses, in the NHS, and at companies. Some schools were teaching that there are multiple genders and insisting children use unisex toilets without any consideration of girls' safety. There were attacks in prisons by male inmates who had designated themselves as transgender. The police were designating biological males who had committed rape as women. The NHS put out guidance about chest feeding and allowed people who were non-biological women into single-sex hospital wards, a policy that has since been reversed. Appallingly, all of this was happening under a Conservative government. Whereas I was prepared to have the fight, too many of my cabinet colleagues wanted to put their heads in the sand. There were even some backbench Tory MPs and advisers in Number 10 who actively supported the self-identifying agenda. As I moved forward with my plans to stop self-ID, there was a barrage of leaks to the press. It became a Saturday night tradition that I would receive a WTF text from Boris demanding to know why our plans had been leaked. I had to point out that as a person who wanted to get this done, it was not in my interest for this to be in the public domain. Had he considered that one of his own advisors might have leaked the story? It felt like we were fighting a battle on the front line from a position of common sense. But the Conservative Party was far from philosophically united on that stance, and Number 10 avoided making a definitive decision, was what they wanted. I eventually got self-ID reserved through a statement. I delivered in the House of Commons that there was a lot of support for women's rights activists and the predictable backlash from the left. Slowly, the tide was turning. 18 months later, the Scottish government was not able to progress its own woke plans due to a public outcry over the gender recognition reform that contributed to the downfall of then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The bill, which was passed by the Scottish Parliament but eventually blocked by the UK government, would have allowed Scottish citizens to legally change their gender at 16 without the diagnosis of gender dysphoria by a doctor. More importantly, they could have applied for the change after living as their new gender for just 3 months. The four-way over the case of the biologically male double rapist Isla Bryson, who was originally incarcerated in a Scottish women's prison and only transitioned after being charged, shone a light on how dangerous wokeism had become, as well as the reluctance among some in government and on the Tory backbenchers to take on the woke orthodoxy. We were also hidebound by the failure of the coalition and conservative governments before us to have changed the underlying legal framework. A lot of the problems we faced were due to the Equality Act of 2010, which was passed in the dying days of the last Labour government. This piece of legislation enshrined in the law the left-wing concept of identity-based politics. That identity politics-based approach has been at the core of the left-wing and Marxist thinking for decades. It embeds collectivism by prioritizing group identity above individuals and their families. That is also why it's so popular with those who like big government. They can take an authoritarian and bureaucratic approach to policing inequality and arbitrate between the competing interests of particular groups. It is one of the biggest successes of the left in recent years, to have had this long-held set of assumptions written into such a totetic piece of legislation, which has governed how the public and cooperative sectors now deal with these issues. I decided that to shift what was happening on the ground in Britain, we needed to take on the Equality Act itself. I wanted to repeal it and replace it with a new law that would ensure fair treatment for everyone, regardless of their characteristics. In other words, it would be grounded in conservative principles of individual liberty and human dignity and be concerned with inequality and equality of opportunity and treatment, not equality of outcome. I wanted a return to liberty and the rule of law. My proposal to repeal and replace the Equality Act was resisted by Number 10, which felt it was too controversial. This, in my view, is emblematic of one of the biggest mistakes we made as conservatives when we took the office in 2010, not rolling back on the encroachment of left-wing thinking into our laws and institutions. We failed to understand what the Labour government was doing, and too many conservatives were merely focused on getting into power, rather than thinking about how to promote conservative ideas. Left-wing notions of identity politics have long sat alongside other instincts, including the desire to police language and an intolerance towards contrary views and debate. The moral, certainly on the left, leads them to believe that those who hold different views are not just wrong but morally inferior, and therefore deserving of, in the modern parlance, being cancelled. It is clearly the job of conservatives to stand up to this and call it out, but too often those on the right are persuaded by the old right side of history argument to go along with the fashionable trend and consensus, and that is how the left wins. It is the reason I was not able to reverse the Equality Act, I was told. We can't possibly repeal it because we don't want to look like we're against equality. Issues like LGBTQ rights and the environment seem progressive and safe. How could any reasonable person possibly be against them? But too often they are used as a Trojan horse for top-down collectivism. What these philosophies all have in common is that they want to take power away from individuals and families and put them in the hands of the authorities. The radical movements promoting sectional rights on environmentalism are always pushing for more, not less. Legislation, more, not less. Red tape for businesses, more, not less. State intervention, and higher, not lower, public spending. This is socialism by the back door. We have reached the point where tax cuts are often seen as having negative political connotations because in people's minds they connotate a lack of caring. This is a huge win for the left. They have successfully linked positive associations to their chosen causes, which are actually very damaging to the country. This has had an impact not only on the left and the public, but even on those who should be challenging it on the right. Some Conservative MPs now appear to make political judgments based on whether or not they pass the London dinner party test, whether voicing a certain opinion with left-wing friends and friends of friends could result in their being treated as a social pariah. They might conclude, for example, they will be condemned as mean, as if they don't support increases in welfare and public spending, or be branded a reactionary zealot if they voice concerns about net zero or trans rights. So they are instead persuaded that they should adopt the prevailing consensus about what is politically acceptable for fear of being condemned as nasty. Modern technology, particularly social media, has not just exposed public figures to greater abuse from trolls and organised campaigner of activities, it has enabled the left-wing guardians of the new political correctness to police views and language, and so people self-censor for fear of being cancelled. One of the reasons this has become so pernicious and restricting is a lack of competition in these new public spaces. Where once we might have had democracy, now there are oligophiles that make these decisions. So if you are a commentator and you get cancelled and deplatformed by the BBC, Sky News, Twitter/X and Facebook, you can't get your message across. When other entrants into the market, such as GB News, attempt to challenge the consensus, they face boycotts by the corporate advertising cartels. The threat presented by the woke movement in the UK and the US, as well as Canada and Australia, has become increasingly clear. There is now a concerted challenge and a threat to our core Anglo-American values. It comes as much from within as from without, with left-wing activists crowding our university campuses and public institutions and seeking to embed a narrative that the West is to blame for all the world's wrongs. Anti-capitalist movements combined with radical environmental campaigners advocates a critical race theory and gender ideologies to find new ways to attack our traditional way of life and divide our society. Virtually all of the things that have made us strong and prosperous are being systematically undermined by those who seek to impose their woke values and close down debate. The underlying assumption is that British and American values are fundamentally bad and need to be torn down. Too many politicians have acquired to this view in the name of being on the right side of history. But it is precisely that history that we need to reclaim. The idea that the British Empire was evil and shameful, or that the US had been a force of oppression, is simplistic and wrong. We should demand that the entire story of our countries, warts and all, be properly told and understood. Not everything in our history was positive, but there was far more good than today's woke revolutionists would ever admit. We should say so. We should always be prepared to be self-critical and question how our societies can be better. Freedom of speech and the ability to challenge our governments and institutions is a fundamental part of our liberal democracy. But in recent times, there has been a tendency to see only the negatives and to deny the positive impact of our beliefs. Self-criticism has become self-flagellation. This is not only damaging to our sense of national identity, but actively plays into the narratives being pushed by our enemies overseas, that Western civilization is in decline and our nations are morally bankrupt. Those who seek to diminish the importance of Western values will only be encouraged when they see us engaged in ever more agonized repudiations of our past and ever more extosiac cultural wars. We need to respond robustly to this challenge. We need to be proud of our core values and tell the story of freedom again. That means being intolerant of intolerance and speaking out loudly and clearly when opponents of freedom seek to curtail legitimate debate. We should also push back against the rewriting of history that seeks to dismiss the many benefits of our core values that are brought to the world. Conservatives cannot afford to be passive in the face of this threat. We need an activist policy to restore our core values, and we can't allow the left to fill the void. Essentially, we need to take on the rot in our institutions, rather than just accepting it. We should be promoting liberty, not wokery. We must focus on individual dignity and humanity, not quotas and targets or equality of outcome. Much of the problem lies in the power of the administrative state. Currently, the silioization of self-identifying agendas, a misinterpretation of impartiality, and a lack of clear chain of accountability have allowed personal and ideological agendas to flourish. It has also meant in many cases that the agenda of the government has been thwarted. We need to restore democratic accountability so that activist officials cannot promote their personal views and using public money. If public officials, currently working in the civil service or one of the hundreds of quangos that are part of the British state, were properly accountable to ministers for all of the work that they do, none of this extraneous activity would be sanctioned. There should also be no grants of public funds to organisations promoting positions that fundamentally undermine our values. I defunded Stonewall in the departments in which I operated as minister. This should be done across the government. We must give parents much greater choice in schooling and ensure greater transparency over curricula in schools, so that they can drive decisions about what their children are taught. We also need to ensure that interest groups cannot get away with bullying businesses into taking particular actions or stances through explicit or implicit threats. Many businesses earnestly set out diversity, equity, and inclusion of environmental, social, and governance policies, as well as a way of virtue signalling and demonstrating support for the latest fashionable cause. However, their actions often end up being discriminatory. Think of the so-called ethical investors who refuse to buy shares in energy or sin industries, or who boycott produce that comes from Israel. There has been a welcome flurry of anti-ESG initiatives in Texas and a number of other US states seeking to prohibit companies that pursue discriminatory ESG policies from benefiting from government investments. In the UK, we should take a similar approach to prevent such companies from bidding for government contracts, for example. Finally, there needs to be a determined effort to root out the same biases and prejudices too often found among the regulators and arbiters whose job it is to stand up for freedom of speech and fair play. It's especially important that this occurs in broadcast media and on social media platforms. The chilling act of deplatforming those with mainstream views, something usually associated with totalitarian regimes, should be deemed beyond the pale in Western democracies. This needs to be done through the development of popular conservative platforms and making some regulators are probably accountable so that they are not operating in a biased way. When I put out my tweet in 2018, I wasn't expecting to be called up to fight on the front line of the equality debate, but I am glad I did it. The madness of identity politics and wokery is doing huge damage to our society and our public services, and it needs to be taken on. Conservatives need to dismantle the architecture that has enabled these fringe ideas to flourish and instead restore the primacy of individual liberty and family and parental authority. I am not prepared to leave the field until the battle is won.